G'day you mob, and welcome back to the Pouch series that I'm doing with my friends Gregg and Jake from the podcast called The Pouch, all about Australian politics. In the next part of this series, we're going to be answering your questions related to Australian politics. So guys, it's an advanced English series here where we are talking naturally, but it is a little bit difficult at times as there are three of us all having a bit of a laugh, having a spontaneous conversation, and we talk over the top of each other, so don't get too stressed out. If you don't hear or understand every single word that we say, the whole point is to be a fly on the wall and practice your listening comprehension when multiple native speakers are having a spontaneous conversation, and at the same time, you're going to be learning about Australia and Australian politics. So guys, without any further ado, tap the Karawong and let's get into it. Sarah wants to know what's happened to ScoMo's popularity after the bushfires and COVID. I think you've sort of touched on that, but do you want to maybe mention how he's dealt with the COVID situation and why Australia's done so well?
That's Sir ScoMo. Thank you, Sarah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Jake, you go.
He's so popular now. He's like, I mean, he could walk out onto Fifth Avenue and kill someone right now, and people would still vote him. No, that's a quote from Trump. No, essentially, he suffered a great deal during the bushfire crisis because there was this perception, whether it was true or not, and whether you actually need a prime minister to, address fires in the states. After we've just discussed, the premise of states' rights versus federal powers. He suffered a great deal because there was this perception of there is a national crisis. Constitutionally, it was happening across, more than one state. Therefore, the federal government had the ability constitutionally to act. Traditionally, the federal government doesn't act unless they're asked by states to act. But equally, because this was a situation where, essentially people, across the country were being affected so detrimentally, so incredibly, so powerfully, there was probably a role for the federal government, for the Prime Minister, or for the relevant minister, for example, to stand up and provide some level of leadership around, what are we going to do to help people recover? What are we going to do to ensure that fire stations have the resources that they need? There were fire crews that had been out fighting fires for over 140 days towards the end of that season. And as a consequence, like the toll that takes, not just on the body, emotionally, physically, mentally.
And they were having to take time off work, volunteer to be firefighters, not get paid, potentially lose their jobs, and have a Prime Minister ScoMo who said, well, they love it, they're volunteers.
Yeah, and therefore we don't want to pay them. But ultimately, he didn't. He and a number of his colleagues in his political party did not, I would say, appropriately address the crisis at hand in a way that was favourable to them as parliamentarians or as public individuals. I would say that towards the end of that bushfire crisis, they were kicking goals. They were appropriately setting up programs to ensure that infrastructure was able to be recovered, and they were funding things appropriately. They were ensuring that, again, as I set up in the premise, that fire stations were ready to respond to the next crisis, etc. There are some reports that the money hasn't necessarily hit the grounds, and to be frank, I haven't investigated those at the moment, or I haven't seen too much to substantiate that, but I have heard that as a rumour. But ultimately, I think the way that the federal government, the way that our Prime Minister has addressed the COVID situation is exactly what you would want out of a leader. He very quickly, took the information on from the World Health Organization that this was serious and that it needed to be addressed. He very quickly named it as a pandemic, actually before the WHO did, and as a consequence, shut the borders to international travellers to prevent, further cases of COVID from coming into the country.
That was funny because at that time I was like, "Whoa, shut the borders to China!" Like, Jesus, that seems a bit full on. And then a week later, you're like, "Whoa, I'm glad he did that."
It was appropriate. Right. I mean, ultimately, you're right, and I had probably the same instinctual reaction, and I think a lot of people did, frankly. But ultimately, that was where, depending on whether you read actual news sources or fake ones, that was where the virus originated, and as a consequence, it was probably wholly appropriate to prevent or restrict travel from regions associated with the virus. But to your question, or to Sarah's question, his popularity has, as you would expect in this type of appropriately managed crisis, has skyrocketed.
Yeah, far out.
If the election were held today, mate, it'd be ScoMo forever.
All right, guys, thank you once again so much for joining me in today's episode. I hope you got a little bit out of this episode and learnt a little bit more about Australia, the Australian political environment, everything like that. And don't forget to go and check out The Pouch, the podcast, where you will be able to listen to episodes released every single week from Jake Farr-Wharton and Gregg Savage. These guys are both Australian, and they're very knowledgeable when it comes to all things Australia, but particularly politics. So go and check out the podcast, guys. And until next time, I wish you all the best.